Hello everyone, Jeff here with A Taste for Whiskey. And notice that I'm not here with my good friend Derek, but I've actually going to introduce you to my good friend Bob Krizek, who is a Scotch aficionado. And I just really want to kind of get into this world of Scotch because it's something new that we've not really discussed. We've talked a lot about it in our perfect pairings, but really want to dive into this world of Scotch because I'm telling you, it's a fascinating world. Bob is a Scotch aficionado, and as a matter of fact, he's poured me something very special, poured us something special.
So what we're drinking while we get started is a Highland Park cask strength 18-year-old Scotch. I was fortunate enough in 2017 to be up at Highland Park and do a half-day session on blending and what they do to put together all of the great expressions at Highland Park. And when it was over with, they allowed us to select one bottle. And I went in the back in the warehouse and they gave us 4 casks to look at. And I picked this cask, 18-year-old, 56.4 ABV, 606 bottles. It's delicious.
Bob, I can't think of a better way to start this series.
A great way to start.
A great way to start, yes.
Salanja, my friend.
Salanja. Well, as you know, I've always been excited with Scotch because you know why? Because you can find Scotch.
You can find Scotch.
I always say, heck, somebody comes out and says, corn whiskeys, mellow corn is the next big thing, and next thing you know, you can't even buy daggone mellow corn, but we can always find Scotch.
You can.
So I want to, we're getting thirsty here, so we've been waiting. I've been looking at this bottle. So we've got some, Bunnahabhain.
Bunnahabhain. The BH is pronounced V. So
Bunnahabhain.
In Gaelic, that means mouth of the river.
So can I just say mouth of the river?
Mouth
Bob,
of the river.
Can I have some mouth of the river?
You certainly can.
Bunnahabhain.
And the reason why I'm starting with some Bunnahabhain, it's an Islay whiskey, but it's non-peated. Most people associate Islay whiskeys with heavy peat, the Laphroaig, the Lagavulin, the Ardbeg, Kehomon, Bowmore. They're all heavily peated. This is an excellent 18-year-old Bunnahabhain. So
now, do we say cheers?
We say slanja.
Slanja. So slanja, my friend. So now this is funny because I'm really excited about this because now we've got our own little. What do we call these?
Well, they're lanyards. So there's a little story behind these. Every year on Islay they have Feis Isle, which is the festival of music and malt on Islay, and when you go, it's a 9-day festival, and each of the distilleries plays host on a given day. And when you go on a day, you go into the distillery. They give you one of these lanyards in a little glass. And you wear it around the distillery, and when you get empty, you just walk up to one of the very nice distillery workers, and they fill up your glass with some more Scotch in there. So this keeps your hands free, you don't lose your glass, and you can hopefully not spill on yourself.
So I usually just slide the glass in.
Oh, I see how this is. So I will say, Bob, what I love about this is we don't get this in American whiskey. We don't get this that I'm aware of at American Whiskey Fest that I've been to.
You don't get Bunnahabhain?
I don't get this kind of a way of how we celebrate.
Oh, okay. I've only seen these over in Scotland and over at the festival.
This is fantastic.
It's a great idea.
I love this, and we're gonna. So tell us what do we have here? We've got an 18-year. So what you say this is one of your daily drinkers?
So it's taken me a long time to figure out what exactly I like in Scotch and what I don't like in Scotch. And one of the things that I know that I don't like is I don't like a burning finish. I like to feel the taste in my mouth. I like structure. I like a viscous Scotch, something that has interest, that coats my entire mouth. So you're getting some sweet, some sour, some spice. And this particular whiskey gives me all of that. The other thing that it does is Bunnahabhain uses sherry casks extremely well. They'll use Pedro Jimenez, they'll use Olorosa, they'll use Amorosa, they'll use the whole range in different finishes. And so this to me is probably my favorite whiskey right now for just drinking when I'm out to enjoy with friends.
Well, I'll tell you what, Bob, this is fantastic. I really get those notes of sherry coming through. And speaking of that, that's really kind of what brought me into Scotch. I love bourbon. I kind of started out on bourbon, kind of went into some rye. But what I found fascinating with Scotch, and what I try to tell a lot of folks is it's a different type of whiskey. Scotch, it's been around a lot longer than American whiskey. The blending has been around for a lot longer than American whiskey doing blending. But really, what got you into Scotch, Bob?
Years ago, I was in the restaurant business, and I started to drink Scotch because I didn't like the taste of it. And what would happen would be I wouldn't drink that much, because when you're in the restaurant business, you're around a lot of alcohol.
Yeah.
And you're buying people drinks, and they want to reciprocate and buy you drinks. So I found myself at times being a little overserved.
Yeah.
So I started to drink Scotch, and at that time there weren't many single malts around. I didn't even know, although we carried maybe a Macallan or a Glenfiddich. We primarily had Johnnie Walker, red, black. We probably had Dewar's. We probably had Grant's.
Yeah.
And I lit upon Johnnie Walker Black was my drink. And for years, that's all I ever drank was Johnnie Walker Black on the rocks.
Wow. So blended, you bring up single malt, and you say that's kind of a newer version of Scotch these days?
It's not newer in that it's been produced more recently than blends. But back in the day, what Scotch was these little distilleries all over Scotland made Scotch for the particular local community. So whatever tastes were developed in this area of Scotland or that area or this valley or this glen was specific to the people in that area. Well, the grocers from Edinburgh and Glasgow decided, well, we're going to try to sell some of this Scotch, but what they found was the taste of the people in the bigger cities didn't coincide with the taste of the people in these isolated areas. So what the grocers did is they bought different single malts in from all over the country, and they blended them together. So Johnnie Walker was a grocer. John Dewar's was a grocer. And what they did is they brought these scotches in and they mixed them together, added some other alcohol, grain alcohol, so not just malts, and they blended it so that it appealed to a broader, more refined
That's fantastic.
audience.
That's the thing I find really interesting about Scotch. And what I fell in love with it is you've got the different regions, and now to find out that, heck, you actually had master blenders, and not necessarily just master distillers, but actually expert blenders that created their own blend that was separate from others.
Right. Now and I don't know if it would even be drinkable, but from what I understand from people I've talked with, the grocers took this whiskey from all these distilleries and they put it into just about any wooden receptacle they could find. So if there was an old barrel that held nails or fish or you name it, they emptied it out, washed it out, and they pour whiskey in there. And then people would come to the grocery store with their own bottles and dip into the barrels and take their whiskey home.
Boy, I'm so glad that the days of the fish barrels are gone. I still like I like the old sherry.
How would you like to nose a little and go, oh, smelt. I like that.
There's a little tuna.
There's a little tuna on the finish. So that's what happened, and over time, then blended Scotch, what the grocers put out, was the overwhelming favorite.
Man,
And only the single malts stayed in these little pockets, primarily drank by the people who lived in those areas.
that's fantastic. That is, and so then we kind of fast forward to today, where whiskey in general, I mean, Scotch, as well as American whiskey, it's just blowing up.
It is. It is. And still, though, when it comes to Scotch, the vast majority of Scotch consumed around the world is blended Scotch.
I never knew
Single
that.
malts take up, I've seen things anywhere from 15 to 20% of the total sales. I've even seen less than that, but it's primarily blended. So in Scotland, the number one Scotch is Famous Grouse, a blended Scotch.
Yeah, we found out about that. We're like, famous grouse.
Famous Grouse, which you can buy here, I think 1.75 liters for about $20.
Yeah.
You know, you can varnish your take the varnish off, and you can
Multi-use.
you know. But J&B, Chivas Regal, all the Johnnie Walkers, Cuddy Sark, Black Bottle, those are all blended Scotches, and those comprise most of the Scotch drank around the world.
I love that. That's fantastic. So when you got into Scotch, you kind of fell in love with, you've really kind of went all in, and you've been to Scotland.
So Johnnie Walker Black was my go-to Scotch. I don't know if I told you this. My mother's family was from Scotland. So in my career, after I was in the restaurant business, I got my PhD and went to a conference over in London and took a train up to Scotland with my wife. And we toured a couple of single malt distilleries. The first one I went to was Dalwhinnie, which is the highest elevation distillery in Scotland. Went there, liked it. Shortly thereafter, I retired. And you need something to do in retirement.
Yep.
So my bucket list was to visit every distillery in Scotland.
Oh man.
So starting from there, and because of my mom's heritage, at the same time I could see if I could learn something about the culture and what it might have been like for my distant ancestors, where they came from, and at the same time pursue Scotch. So I've gotten into, now I'm a single malt guy. I try every single malt I can get my hands on.
I think I'm with you.
Yeah.
I think I really have kind of found my sweet spot in the single malts.
Mm-hmm.
The blends, like the Johnnie Walkers, I'm with you. That's sort of where I started. Really like the Johnnie Walker Green.
Yeah.
Just a fantastic, not overly peated, but a little, kind of got this nice peat, but yet a little bit of the sherry. I believe there's some sherry finish in there.
Well, your Johnnie Walker Green is not a blended Scotch. It's a blended malt. So there's a category of blended Scotches, which are single malts plus grains, plus wheat, corn, whatever else to mellow it out. Things like the Compass Box Scotches, Johnnie Walker Green, Monkey Shoulder are blended malts. There is no other grain in those other than malted barley.
Oh, that's
so
nice.
People like Johnnie Walker Green because it is purely
malt. I love that. Well, that's why we like it.
So that's why we like it. Right, and people who like Compass Box, you're drinking blended malts, not blended Scotch.
That's awesome. I love it. Well, so do you have a map of where you've been?
Yeah, I do.
Let's see what this looks like.
So every good professor has visual aids, and so what this is a map of Scotland with the 5 regions, and you see the lowlands, you see Speyside where all these dots are. You see the Highlands, which is the bigger part with the orange. You see this little area down here, which is Campbellton.
My favorite.
And this is the Islay area. Those are the 5 areas. And each of the pins represents a distillery I've been to at least once.
He's been to a lot of distilleries.
42 so far. It's getting harder and harder because many distilleries are just production facilities and you can't get into them. You got to know somebody who knows somebody to try to get into the distilleries.
Oh man, this is so cool. So this is why Bob knows Scotch. right?
Right? Yeah.
I mean, you've been there,
I've
you've
been
seen
there.
it.
Yeah.
You've tasted out of the cask. I mean, just fascinating.
So when we go, we go to the distilleries. We do not do the standard sort of tourist tours.
Yeah, that's great.
We'll go back and we will do cask tastings. We'll go back into the warehouse.
Oh,
One of the places...
that's what I want to do.
You'll love it. One of the places I went to, Glenfarclas, although I'm not a big Speyside fan, it's not my favorite area, but there's a distillery up there called Glenfarclas, and Glenfarclas is family owned. It's not a conglomerate owned. And when you go in there, the people are just a hoot. They're just a riot. And we went there, and we're back with the manager, a guy named Colin. And we're in the back, and he says, name a date, name a year.
Oh, I love this, yeah.
And I was there with two of my friends, and we graduated high school in 1966. So we said, 1966. He said, follow me. So we go through all of the these old dunnage warehouses with black mold. I mean, these are really dank places. You get halfway high just smelling.
Smelling it, yep.
Yeah. So we go back. He leads us up to a cask, 1966, on the barrel head. He takes the extractor. He pulls the bung cork out of it, and he takes his siphoning, copper siphoning tube, and he sucks it out. Has us put our glasses down, and he fill up the glasses, and we sat there for about an hour drinking whiskey that at that time was 49 years old.
49-year-old whiskey.
Right out of the cask.
Right out of the cask.
It was good.
That is fascinating.
It was very good. So yeah.
So that's the other thing I find interesting with Scotch is the weather in Scotland. You know, aging a barrel here in the States in American whiskey, it feels like, 15 years, 20 years almost becomes too oaky, too tannic a little bit. But in Scotland, what makes Scotch where you can literally drink a 40-year-old Scotch and still find some great flavors?
Yeah. So I have to admit, while you can still find great flavors, I find the 18 to 21 and something like a Highland Park, maybe 25-year-olds, those are the sweet spots for the distilleries for me, because what they do is they balance the influence of what comes out of the still, the new make, with what wood they're in. If it's too young, you're getting primarily the taste of what comes out of the still.
Okay.
If it's too old, you're getting the wood. So it becomes a very delicate balance between the two. And so I'll go to each distillery, and I'll try to figure out what's the range at that distillery that I can still say, I can taste the character of Bunnahabhain in this, but I also know that it's got sherry or sometimes finished in maybe a wine cask, and I can get a little bit of that to make it complex, to make it interesting in your mouth. And then I find that spot. Now, I'm not saying I wouldn't love to have some 40-year-old scotches, and I do have some, but I find that after a while, you're getting mostly the taste of wood, and you cease to be able to isolate on your palate what makes that distillery taste unique.
I think that's pretty, because the first time that we talked, one of the things you had me do was kind of talk about the distinctive flavors, the difference in Bunnahabhain and Highland Park.
Highland Park. I thought you were going to say Higland Park.
Higland Park. With Scotch, you just never know.
You never know.
So, and one of your other favorite distilleries is Highland Park.
Highland Park.
Yeah. And I think that the fun part about whiskey, and even more fun about Scotch, is being able to sort of tell that difference between each of the distilleries based off of their unique profile that they've kind of developed.
Yeah. And I think this is a little bit unfortunate today, is because of access shipping wise and product wise, that distilleries can move away from what's local and get barley from all over, that some of that uniqueness is being lost. And I find that to be a shame. And I tend to gravitate, as Bunnahabhain is, to distilleries that tend to do things the way they've done it for decades, if not a couple hundred years.
I think that's the other thing that puts Scotch kind of ahead is that we're talking how many years? American whiskey. I mean, what? Within 100 years.
So where did American whiskey come from?
Oh, I don't know.
So
Scotland.
So if for those of you who drink Maker's Mark, you see Maker's Mark spells it the Scottish way, Whisky. That's because Maker's Mark's ancestors were Scottish. Now here's something that people don't know. They think that Scotland broke off of Europe. It did not. There was another mass that was Scotland in the eastern United States and eastern Canada and Greenland that were a land mass. And when it broke up, Scotland went off in one direction and the eastern coast of Canada and the United States in another direction. So the geological makeup of the Appalachian Mountains is most similar to the mountain range in Scotland.
I love that.
So the Scottish people in the 1800s, and this happened why my family came to the New World as well, is they had the Scottish clearances. And the Scottish clearances were the landlords figured out that they could make more money raising cows and sheep than they could with sharecroppers.
Okay.
So what they did is they literally burned out their own sharecroppers, moved them to Australia, the United States, or Canada. So here you got these people from Scotland. They need to make a living. They don't know what else to do. So what do you think they did?
Make whiskey.
They made whiskey.
There you go.
And in the United States, the crop that was easy for them to get was corn. So they used corn as opposed to barley, where barley's easy to grow in the wet, damp, cold climate of Scotland. Corn was easy here, so they started making whiskey. So most of your American whiskey, the EY whiskey, their traditions and heritage come from their Scottish forefathers.
That is. Who would have ever thought?
Who would have thought?
So we still have a little bit of Scotch influence even in our American whiskey. So Bob, I like to always ask this questions. What are some of the top 5 reasons you would think somebody who is really into American whiskey would kind of move into Scotch? What are they missing out on?
So I'm not here to say that Scotch is better than.
Right.
It's different than.
Absolutely, I would agree 100%.
And I would say if you're, you know who Ron Burgundy was?
Yes.
So if you're a Ron Burgundy, it doesn't make a difference what you drink because all you're doing is hammering it down. But if you're a person who likes to drink bourbon, American single malt, American rye, or Scotch, and you like to figure out the complexity, the tastes, then Scotch offers more, I think, more of that complexity than bourbon does. Plus, I really like mouthfeel. I don't know what it is about the feel of Scotch in my mouth. It feels thicker. It feels more viscous. It tends to coat my mouth and tongue and even the first part of my throat more.
Absolutely.
And so the tastes last a little bit longer, where with American whiskey, bourbon, it tends just to, for me, slide right down.
A little more thin.
A little thinner.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it. The other thing I think people who really enjoy Scotch like the sort of historical or the terroir, spelled Terroir, the local matters. And in Scotland, the local matters. So if you're on one side of the mountains in Scotland, it's a very different sort of aging than it is on the other side. Some Scotches, and I actually don't think these 5 Scotch regions do justice to it. I think there should be more.
Right. Even within the regions. They're very different.
So you get up in Highland Park, which is up here in Orkney, or you get Oban down here, or you get Pulteney up here. Those are maritime Scotches, and they age their barrels right near the ocean. So what happens is barrels are kind of a living creature.
Mm-hmm.
What's given off in the angel share, the 4% of year 2 to 4% a year that they lose,
Yeah.
that you get to smell in the warehouses when you go
absolutely.
in, gets filled in with air. And so if you're in a maritime area, that's salt air going into that Scotch. So you drink something like Old Pulteney, you will get more of a brine.
See, I love that.
A brine. If you're drinking stuff from down in Islay, they're getting the currents from the Atlantic Ocean right in there, and historically their peat has a lot of seaweed in it. So peat's the vegetable matter that they use to dry the barley. It has a lot of seaweed in it, and seaweed has iodine as one of the chemicals, the same chemical.
That Band-Aid that people talk about.
So when people drink the peated Scotch, the Laphroaig, the Ardbeg, the Lagavulin, the Kehomon, the Bowmore, Colilla, all of those, they're getting that medicinal smoke and peat that traditionally came from the peat they used. They went out in the peat bogs and they cut bricks because there are no hardwood trees to burn. They cut the bricks and they use that to dry. They put it underneath the malted barley, or the barley as they were drying it. They put it up, and the smoke would infuse into the barley.
That is. See, that's what I love about.
So that's all the shit you like to hear.
That is
because that's what makes it interesting, and that's what keeps me going back. Is every time I go, I sit down with another distillery manager or another warehouse worker, and he'll tell me a story. And I'll learn something about what makes this particular Scotch interesting, why this is different than this, what they do here that's different than here. And they're very careful not to say we're better, we're more exclusive. It's we have our own ways of doing things.
That's what makes Scotch so fun. I feel like that's kind of what drew me in. It's kind of what drew me into bourbon, is sort of the history. Then you get into Scotch, and there's just so much more history, so much more to learn. And see, we got another one.
Could I talk you into a little bit?
Twist my arm.
Twist your arm. So we were down here in Bunnahabhain. We were here on Islay, down here, and that's the first one we had. But the Atlantic Ocean is over here, and the currents come in here, and this is Lagavulin, Laphroaig, and Ardbeg down here. Bunnahabhain's on the coast up here with Jura. So this is another island, Jura, here. So they get a different kind of peat up there that they use to dry. From here, we're going all the way up to Orkney.
Oh, man.
And Orkney is where Highland Park is, and Highland Park's peat that they use comes from the Hobbister peat bog, and the Hobbister peat bog is the oldest peat bog they have found on Earth.
Wow.
And it gives Highland Park a very different, less medicinal, a little bit of smoke, a little bit of, I think, a touch of the like barbecue rib kind of meat in there, but you don't get that medicinal iodine. When I was a kid, my mom, every time you got cut, would slap mercurochrome on your finger. So when I drink something like Lagavulin and I smell it, it takes me right back to my mom putting mercurochrome on the cuts on my fingers.
And it still tastes good.
It still tastes good. So Highland Park is another, and you notice 18 years old.
Yeah, that's your sweet spot.
It's kind of my sweet spot. It's my affordable sweet spot.
Yeah.
Bunnahabhain makes an excellent 25-year-old, but you got to be pretty well heeled to be drinking a lot of that.
Yeah.
Highland Park has a wonderful 21-year-old, a great 25-year-old, but they start to get up in prices that I would reserve only for special occasions.
That makes sense.
So would you like a little?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to let you pour your own.
Here we go.
We see the glass sliding in from the camera.
Sliding in again here. So as we pour this Highland Park, what are some of the characteristics of Highland Park that you really like?
Well, why don't we do this? Why don't you take a taste of it and let me know, and not necessarily...
Ooh, I get some of that sherry influence, for sure.
So Highland Park's owned by a company called Edrington, And Edrington owns Macallan's
Mm-hmm.
and owns Glenrothes. I think it's Glenrothes. And they season their casks in sherry. They don't age them in sherry casks. They take sherry, pour them into the bourbon casks.
Oh.
So the sherry gets on it, and then they pour it out and pour the whiskey into them.
Little cheat.
So whiskey can be aged. A lot of whiskey's aged in bourbon barrels, but it can be aged in sherry barrels. So some whiskeys spend their entire life in ex-sherry barrels. Some whiskeys take what's been in bourbon barrels and sherry barrels and put them together. Some finish their whiskeys in sherry barrels, so they spend most of their life in whiskey barrels and then maybe a year or two in sherry. But then others just put their whiskey into barrels that were treated with sherry.
Oh, man.
And that'll give you different flavors.
See, look at all of the options that you have with Scotch. Not just the that iodine or that thing that you put on your cuts.
That's mercurochrome, and that's the problem. So people normally, when they start drinking Scotch, somebody shoves them a glass of Lagavulin, and they drink Lagavulin. They go, "Pooh, man! How could anybody drink this stuff? It's just terrible," and it turns them off to Scotch forever. But if you ease into it, if you drink and know that's just one of hundreds of different flavor profiles, and that's not all Scotch, then I think you're doing yourself a better service.
I agree. I feel like this is that's the number one misconception of peated Scotch, or Scotch in general, is you start off with the peated Scotch and then you're like, I'm out. This tastes like a Band-Aid. But what I think you miss out on is save the peat for later. And when you start out as Bob talked about, go into a blended, go into a Johnnie Walker Black, and then move into some sherry finished, where you really kind of get those notes of the sweetness of the sherry, but the dryness and the kind of the mellow and the complexity of the whiskey itself.
And hopefully we do some more of these videos and tastings. And there's one rule that I'll always insist upon, is never start with the heavily peated stuff.
Amen.
Because the heavily peated stuff will that taste, and for me, it actually coats my nose, so when I smell anything, that's all I smell.
You just smell bacon all day long.
And mercurochrome.
That's right.
So always start out, if you're doing a tasting of multiples, start out with, let's say, your Speyside. Start out with a Balvenie Double Wood, which is most like an American whiskey, and then move up to something like an Old Pulteney, which is a maritime that's primarily bourbon cask. Then move into some sherry casks like a Glendronach or a Glenrothes. And then from there, start venturing into some of the peated stuff.
Like the Campbelltown.
Like the Campbelltown.
Did I say that right? I say Campbell. It's Campbelltown.
Campbellton. And what's interesting, did you know this? Campbellton at one time was the largest producing whiskey area in Scotland. And now there's only 3 distilleries in Campbellton. Now let's see if you do you know why?
Oh, I don't know why.
Campbellton had direct access to the United States shipping routes. And when Prohibition came, all but 2 of the distilleries in Campbellton shut down because their entire market was the United States. Wow. The other distilleries on the eastern side of Scotland, and places like Lagavulin and Laphroaig, which is another story I could tell, they developed a market in France and in Italy and all over. Wow. So they weren't killed by Prohibition in the United States. So you come here now, and you come down here. Here's Campbellton.
Yeah.
Here's Ireland.
Yeah.
Here's the Atlantic Ocean. They had a straight shot over the United States. Now there's only 3 distilleries down in Campbellton. They're great distilleries. Springbank, Glen Scotia, and Glengyle. They're great, but that's all that's down there. And when you drive around Campbellton, all you see, or not all you see, obviously you see other stuff, but you see the ruins of distilleries that they still have the gates up and the front of the warehouse and stuff, but they're all
Just the history.
just the history. It's all over the place. Yeah.
This is fantastic. What I'm getting on, I can nose this literally. I don't even have to drink it. I can just nose this. I mean, it's just that full flavor. That's
So what do you get? What do you get out of this?
well. So I get the sherry. I get a little bit of cinnamon. I get some dark fruits. My favorite, I get some of that raisin, some of that
raisin,
plum.
yeah.
Mhm.
I get a little bit of nuts in here too.
Yes, absolutely.
And so why do I like these in particular? When I say these are kind of my go-to, both of them finish right about here. They stay in my mouth. They don't go down. I don't get a burn down here, and I like that. I've found that about myself is I really don't get that strong burn down here. They stay in my mouth, and it creates an interest in different parts. It's not just the roof of my mouth. It's not just the tongue. It's just not under the tongue. It's all over my mouth. It's interest. So I can sit there and kind of,
You can go different places.
Right. And that's the other thing, the anti-Ron Burgundy is when you drink Scotch, this is the way I was taught to drink it. After you've nosed it and you get all your aromas out of it, you take it.
The chew.
Because your mouth has different taste buds on different parts of your tongue. And if all you're doing is pouring it down the hatch, you're missing the best part of Scotch, which are the unique flavors that you can get. Dark cherry, caramel, plum,
Yeah.
a little bit of raisins, a little bit of smoke, not a lot of
Just
smoke.
a smidgen on the
Just
back. Yeah.
On the back.
Mhm.
On the back. And it stays there, kind of coats the roof of my mouth. It's a lovely, and as you probably know, and as I'm sure with American whiskey, there's different expressions, different ages, not ages, but different times at which they were distilled.
Right.
This particular Highland Park 18 is the previous version to what's out now. I highly recommend this version. I like the new version, but for the same price, if you find this on the shelf, gobble it up. It's much better.
This is, and that's the thing. I think distilleries change the processes. The water's different. I've never could understand why a 1960 distilled Jim Beam tastes nothing like a 2015 Jim Beam. Nothing. I can't even drink a Jim Beam, but I can drink a 1960 Jim Beam all day long. And I kind of find that, Scotch is probably very similar.
Yeah, it is. It is. So on Bunnahabhain, if you look at the label, there's a sea captain. The previous iteration, the sea captain was saluting. If you find the previous iteration,
That's the one to get.
gobble it up all day long. All day long. So Bunnahabhain, the key is the salute in Highland Park, because of the proximity to Norway and Sweden up there in the North Sea. They've gone totally in on Viking lore.
Yep.
And they've done all the carvings, all the Viking. And it's not bad. When you go to Orkney and you go into the distillery, you just run into Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and believe me, they know how to drink. They drink a lot. And they love, and so that's Highland Park's big market now, is northwestern Europe.
Well,
And those bottles cater to that.
that is fantastic. I'll tell you, Bob, this is great. And I think that I look forward to doing more stories, talking more a little bit about your journey, and just seeing where this Scotch world goes. Because I believe there's a lot of people out there that love Scotch. They just don't know that they love it. So we're gonna continue to take you on that journey as we talk more with Bob about some cool things, some things that he's been into, some things that he's going to be doing, and just his journey. So Salanja.
Salanjavar.